Bismillah, wassalatu wassalam ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Lockdown Library. I'm Asim Qureshi, and today I'm hoping to talk a little bit about solitary confinement. Of course, it's appropriate considering at this time, most of us, I hope, are self-isolating, at least those of us who aren't needed as frontline workers, as necessary individuals out there. We should all be trying our best to stay at home as much as possible. But I think because people are struggling in some ways with this a little bit, there are certain people who are making statements trying to equate it to other things like prison. So we have the US comedian Ellen, for example, saying it's like being in prison. Well, it's not really. And so today I just want to talk a little bit about two very different areas of the work that I do and books that have been written about those areas, but to try and link them together so that we understand a little more about what it means to be under a system of surveillance, to have our liberty taken away from us, and to really think about, even the fact that right now we're self-isolating. In some ways, we're actually extremely privileged in the way that we're able to gain access to food, to have the freedom to use the internet, and so many other benefits that other people simply don't have. So I want to start off really by talking about one book. It's a book of philosophy. It's called Drone Theory by Gregoire Chamayou. He's a French philosopher. So that might seem a bit strange that I'm pointing to a book of philosophy about drone warfare. But this is an extremely, extremely important book. It was a book that really spoke to me about how deeply I was thinking about the whole notion of what drone warfare actually is. Before it was just simply about, I guess, lives that were being lost by these pilotless machines that were flying in the sky, killing innocent people, many people at even at weddings. And yes, of course, I was thinking about it, intellectually as being a new development in warfare, but I really hadn't engaged, I guess, with its deeper meanings and deeper significances. And I think that's what Chamayou does very, very well throughout the course of the book. He really thinks about, well, what does this mean, not just for the individual, but for society as a whole? And I promise you that by the end of this video, I will bring it back to this idea of confinement and around solitary confinement that I really want to focus on. So, I mean, to start with, I think it's important to say that there was one reflection that Shammai has in particular that I thought was quite profound. He says that there's something extremely strange and distant about the drone operator. We talk a lot. He mentions about the kamikaze pilot. The Japanese pilots who would fly airplanes, into their targets with the pilot in them. And of course, we know about suicide bombers as well. So this is kind of like the closest, most visceral form of violence that you could imagine. But the drone operator is actually the complete opposite of that. Here is somebody who is as far removed from the notion of sacrifice that you could possibly imagine, because there is no repercussion for him in the warfare that he's engaging in. It's simply a case of, being on his joystick, flying this drone around and killing whichever target he's told to kill. It's that distant. There's no comeuppance. There's no risk involved whatsoever. And Chamayou says about the suicide bomber or the kamikaze, the former implies the death of the agent. The latter totally excludes it. Kamikazes are those for whom death is certain. Drone pilots are those for whom death is impossible. In this sense, they represent two opposite poles on the spectrum of exposure to death. In between, the two are classic fighters, those for whom death is a risk. So drone operators they don't have that same sense of magnitude in many ways of what the taking of a life actually means. And really, of course, it takes on a completely different meaning when we realize that this is a system that's entirely built on trust, that we need to trust the drone operators, that the people that they're targeting are the right people. And that's a very, very tall ask, especially when you consider the history of, in America's case in particular, of them getting it wrong and quite consistently wrong too. So I think that's something very important for us to think about, that just in its essence, the way that drones and drone warfare is conceptualized is so deeply problematic because it involves a barbarization, it involves a dehumanization of the enemy because there's no personal risk involved here. Which in many ways, actually, throughout history, we've seen with soldiers that part of what turns soldiers away from the brutality of their fellow soldiers is seeing the perpetrating of horrors and abuses. So I think that's something important for us to consider. But coming to the main point of the discussion here, it's one around what Shamaya calls like the endless circling watchtowers. That drones have now taken on this other meaning where you're effectively imprisoned by their circling watching of you. And I just want to read another quote from him. He says, "Drones are indeed petrifying. They inflict mass terror upon entire populations. It is this, over and above the deaths, the injuries, the destruction, the anger, and the grieving, that is the effect of permanent lethal surveillance. It amounts to a psychic imprisonment within a perimeter no longer defined by bars, barriers, and walls, but by the endless circling of flying watchtowers up above." So that's really fascinating because he's taking the idea of the drone and he's saying that actually this has such a much deeper significance for us because it's not just about the killing, but it's about how we as individuals, and especially those who are facing the violence of it directly, feel in relation to these objects in the sky that are constantly watching them. So if you have a piece of French bread that's too long, will it mistake it for something else? They're constantly, having to double guess their own lives in relation to these things that exist in the sky that make up their own minds about what your actions have to do with anything. So they might claim, oh, he was holding a rifle, but in fact, it might have been an object that was far more mundane. So that produces its own anxiety. That produces its own form of, what he refers to as psychic imprisonment. And the thing that really struck me and why I wanted to relate it to the other book I want to talk about is this idea of this distance, this huge distance between the drone operator and the ones that are being affected, or the ones who are being surveilled, and also the mechanization of the whole thing. And it's this book here that I then want to come to. It's a collection of essays called "Hell is a Very Small Place," and so voices from solitary confinement. So it's directly from those who have faced solitary confinement, detained largely in the US. It's edited by Gene Casella, James Ridgway, and the introduction was written by Sarah Shroud, or the foreword. Sarah Shroud, some of you may be or Shord, sorry, be familiar. She was detained in Iran for 410 days in solitary confinement during that period of time. And her story is fascinating. It's worth reading every single essay that's written in this collection, and it's across a range of different experiences. So it's not just, say, for example, war on terror related cases, but there are many long-term historical cases in here as well as essays by practitioners. They have also contributed their words, and I think it's important to get both perspectives. So those who are suffering at the hard end of solitary confinement, but also those who are trying to help those who are being affected by solitary as well. And there is there's a moment that comes where Five Mu'allim, AK, he's one of the writers in the collection. He specifically mentions that, you know, everything now for them, those who are imprisoned in these high security prisons in solitary confinement, is done through a mechanized process, that you never even see a guard anymore, that the doors are opened and closed via buttons that are pressed, so that, they just literally, the button is pressed, they leave, a button is pressed, they are imprisoned again. That you have this constant process of dehumanization taking place, because without that human contact, without the ability for for your guard to see you, to understand you and your value as a human being, then you're never going to get any kind of sympathy or empathy in the place that you're in. So he says, there was nothing to hear except empty, echoing voices from other parts of the prison. I was so lonely that I hallucinated words coming out of the wind. They often sounded like whispers. Sometimes I smelled the paint on the wall, but more often I just smelled myself, revolted by my own scent. There was no touch. My food was pushed through a slot, doors were activated by buzzers, even the one that led to a literal cage directly outside of my cell for 1 hour per day for recreation. So we see that there there is an absolute dehumanization that links the logic between drones with solitary confinement, that as much as possible they want to mechanize as many processes they can, so that those who are being detained, those who are being watched, there's no ability for a human being to see them anything other than as a target. And that's extremely worrying for us in our larger world, in our larger thinking about how we build societies that are full of sympathy, of compassion, of empathy. Um, I think the way that the world is currently constructed, these structures that exist in the prison systems that we have, in the larger systems that we have, they're all designed now in order to produce the maximum benefit that they can for customers, with as little human interaction as possible. So even like you're trying to get to call centers now, it's very difficult to get in touch with a human being directly. And I think all of this contributes to one another. Of course, some people will talk about how inside systems of neoliberalism in particular, this is almost an ultimate ethic, that you have as much being produced or as much being done by as little kind of human contact as possible. So coming back to the point about us being self-isolation, I guess, you know it is hard. I understand that. I'm not trying to negate anybody's experience here, but I do think that we have to think a little bit about the privileges that we have in these moments. The fact that we're not under these systems of surveillance yet. Of course, we see a lot of movements in order to bring those in. But while we should be aware of the way that laws are changing in order to bring in stronger surveillance, we're not prisoners. We do have a lot of agency. We do have the ability to go out and get essentials. We do have the ability to order things. We do have the ability to contact our families, even if it is online, as much as we like. So, that's the kind of the key message that I wanted to give today, that there are very difficult things going on out there in the world for many people. They're struggling every single day to survive, and we should try and not make claims to having even experienced an iota of what they're going through, simply because we're going through a very temporary period of hardship. And to finish maybe with one quote again from the book on solitary confinement. This is really, I mean, this is what it means. This is one of the writers says, about what that lack of contact actually means. He says, I try to explain to people how the sensory deprivation and the absence of human contact affects a person. I try to make them see how much we need human validation. The very essence of life is human contact and the affirmation of existence that comes with it. Losing that contact, you lose your sense of identity. You become nothing. That's what I mean when I say I became invisible even to myself. Again, where we should try and support one another as much as we can, especially those people who are completely alone. We should reach out to them. But we also should recognize that, inshallah, especially during this month of Ramadan, we have the opportunity in some ways to develop relationships, spiritual relationships, of course, primarily to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also like for those of us who are isolated with our families, to rekindle relationships with them in ways that maybe otherwise our work and the dunya somehow constantly take us away from. So, try and think about this experience in a more positive light for yourselves. I know I'm trying to do that myself. It is difficult at times, but I just say to myself constantly, like, alhamdulillah, like it's really not that hard when I consider what else is going on out there. So I hope that some of you will pick these books up. If you do, do write to me. Let me know what you thought about them, and inshallah, we can keep on talking about the various books that I'm suggesting, and also hearing back from you about the books that you're reading that maybe relate to these topics in some way. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Islam 21C brings to you 20 brand new unique series from renowned and respected shuyukh from across the globe, with one mission: to bring Muslims together in an online congregation never seen before in history, and lift the spirit of this Ramadan to bring us closer to Allah more than ever.
Man is left with no way of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala other than by virtue of his names and his majestic attributes that he gave himself and gifted humanity with.
We want to raise our children in the most perfect way, and perfection belongs to Allah. If a person comes to you whose religion and character pleases you, then get your daughters married to him.
It's not going to be easy, but Allah never leaves you alone. That's the essence of what we can get from the Prophet's life.
It's my pleasure, it's my honor to introduce Quran recitation from the Imam Jazari Institute.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله.
Now just think with me about the verse where Allah says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُمْسِكُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ أَن تَزُولَا.
We'll start with an easy one for you, Sheikh, inshallah. Can I postpone Taraweeh until the last third of the night?
Yeah, so essentially the night prayer is offered after Salat al-Isha, and you have until Salat al-Fajr to offer that.
We're all linked together in this. And that's really what empathy is. I mean, empathy in Arabic is like ataf, atuf, to tilt towards, to move towards.
Conveying insults. You know, the Arabs had a saying, "Ma shatamak illa man ballagak." The one who insulted you is the one who conveyed the insult to you.
There can be no more greater relationship of a husband and a wife than the Prophet ﷺ and Khadija.
We don't just leave that piece of knowledge that we've received just there on the page.
This virus is a mercy for us Muslims, because the Prophet ﷺ, he told us in a hadith that when you're afflicted with something, it's an expiation of your sins.
Down to earth like gravity, imagine me trying to turn my dreams to reality.
Allah Jalla Ala mentioned those who come in the front. وَالسَّابِقُونَ السَّابِقُونَ. They are the most successful people.
How we can embed the love of our Quran in the hearts of the young generation.
Welcome to the online masjid.